One thing that I'm a communications scholar in one regard, so I spend a lot of time thinking about language. And one thing that strikes me about this concept of transformation that we've talked a little bit about over the last day and a half is that it's a very dynamic term. So it's an active term and it's a transitory term, and it brings up this notion of a before and then an after. The humanities also has a lot to contribute to these conversations, and we haven't heard much about how the humanities can intersect with government science advice and science yet, but they are experts in making meaning of imagined worlds. So if we're imagining our transformed futures, then we should be engaging with expertise in making meaning of these imagined worlds to help us unpack and deeply think about what those futures might entail and how they might impact real life. So I wanted to mention the work of Claire Craig, who's the Vice President of INGSA, and she's done a collaboration with Sarah Dillon, which is around story listening. And this is a notion that we can pay attention to stories that abound in society, both in our sort of media, political domains, but also in fiction and science fiction and you know, pop culture, to help us tap into public reasoning about science and technology issues. And they also propose this interesting concept that I really like to play around with, which is that to develop narrative models that complement computational models. So much of our work in science and technology looks at drawing quantitative information to derive computational models that allow trends to be projected into the future, but they tell us a lot about the biophysical world, and that's so valuable. Narrative models are posited by Dillon and Craig to be a complement to computational models that allow us to think through the social world, the cultural world, and to develop a suite of potential futures in the same way that we have a suite of potential outcomes from computational models, a suite of potential futures that we can understand and unpack, and once they're generated, critique and sort of drive towards which ones we want to go to, what parameters feed into those, what cultural considerations need to come into that. So the reason this matters for government science advice is because everyone in that system is a human being with an imagination of where we're heading to. And we've heard a lot of this coming up, this sort of idea of collectiveness and collaboration and storytelling, and ways that we can bring people together. I think telling stories collectively with expert-informed contributions that make them believable and rigorous is a method that we need to develop skills in and processes in, so that we are able to contextualize science government advice with these potential futures that we might be heading towards, and so that we can know that if that's the story that we want to be a part of, what knowledges do we need to get there, what people do we need in the room to talk to, and how do we bring the right people along with us, so that the story that we take through this transformation into the future is one that accounts for matters of equity, matters of justice, and science that's fit for purpose for what it's trying to achieve. Thinking through stories, it reminds me of something that was said yesterday in one of the plenaries around flipping between this high-level abstraction thinking and then the anecdotal sort of storytelling mode, and how do we do both and how do we move between both. And I think that one of the things I love about story as a method and telling stories as a method, one, it's low tech, so it doesn't actually have that much of a resource demand. You can do it with a pen and paper, or you can do it without anything if you're really clever and can remember well. But the other thing is that it's not just a generation tool, it's a thinking tool. And in telling a story, you need to set it in a believable world. And so some of the best, most compelling fantasy stories are amazing because they are set in believable worlds. And those worlds aren't real, but they are believable. And I think in the act of building a world through narrative telling, you have to engage with these notions of well, what goes into that broader context to make this believable. So you need to have those conversations about the wider system, and then who is moving through that system. So I love story because it centers characters. You have to have a character, but you have to have a world as well. And so I see it as a really powerful tool to to sort of shift between those two domains. The other thing that strikes me is learning from history, particularly with that how do we do system change, but really paying attention to the stories that come out and are recorded from times of transformative change in the past, and from different contexts and from different cultures. What strikes me about sort of the conversation on the panel and sort of where we're all coming from is that these skills are really all around thoughtfulness. So we've got the thoughtfulness and institutional thoughtfulness, not just individualistic ones, but how do we operationalize thoughtfulness in our workplaces and in our engagements? So the reflexivity component of how do we become collectively thoughtful about who we are and what we bring to the table, and how do we think back on our actions and behaviours. Unpacking the assumptions, so it's a thoughtful practice to kind of posit a hypothesis and then think through, well, what does that mean, and is that right, and do some of the testing around it. And then the thoughtfulness of thinking through solutions and how we might navigate through them. And doing that through generating a tangible output that we can then use to examine, because it's out there, it's no longer sort of in our minds. But what I like about thoughtfulness is that it also has a sort of connotation of kindness and a connotation of humanity. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind with all of these conversations, because we want to orient towards just transformation and reducing inequalities as we do this transition and as we move towards the afters. So I think that these skills in thoughtfulness are really important, not just for the practical, what do we do in our jobs, but also how do we approach it from our hearts. So